Hey everybody, hope you're doing well, and welcome back to Parkitect. Today I'm gonna try and tackle Honey Hills, which is the second scenario that I've made for the game, so I was really still trying to find my ground in terms of what these scenarios would be like. So yeah, it's quite large and the map isn't too difficult to work with, but this also gives some good opportunities to build stuff, I think. Now the goals aren't too difficult. There's a goal of getting 400 guests into the park, having no loan debts, which we don't start off with any loans, so that should be fine. An operating profit of $2,000 a month, which is maybe going to be the most difficult part of this, and an overall park rating of 75%. So yeah, altogether, it's not a very difficult scenario. We start off with some hilly land here. Really the idea behind this scenario was to try and get used to more difficult to work with terrain. So there are some small flat sections, especially around this area, where you can build like some main kind of area, but aside from that it's all very hilly. So yeah, the challenge here will mostly just be the terrain. And we start off with this coaster called Bumblebee, which is a bit ironic because a bumblebee doesn't make any honey. Or, well, not really honey. It makes a kind of honey apparently. But yeah, it's a cool sounding name, okay. It doesn't have to be entirely scientifically accurate. Anyway, that's all. I'm gonna start building and we'll see where it goes. Alright, so something I just noticed and I want to point out before I forget to do it in any other video is that these time-lapse sections are much more bright and saturated than the real-time sections. And I don't know why, but for some reason OBS is what I use to record my real-time section, and OBS just makes the whole game look a little bit less bright. And I record my time-lapses with Fraps. I was originally hoping to do all of it with Dxtory, or Dxtory, I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, but for some reason it didn't want to cooperate with Parkitect, so I'm using Fraps instead, which, as much criticism as it tends to get, at least it actually shows how saturated and bright Parkitect is, because OBS just kind of tones down everything. So what you see during the time lapses is actually a more accurate representation of what I see when I'm working on the game. I was thinking about just manually upping the brightness and contrast in editing, but I don't know how I feel about that idea. But in any case, it's something that I've noticed, and if it's something that for some reason you noticed as well, here you go, this is why. Anyway, let's move into what I'm actually doing here. I've had quite a few requests to build more log flumes, and I think that's a pretty good idea, so I'm starting off with the log flume on this scenario, especially because this is quite a terrain heavy scenario. That's really the only challenge that we get here, and for me, I like a good log flume, but I love a good terrain-conforming log flume, especially when they're themed and they've got some interaction with other rides. This is what log flumes are best at, I think, especially given that you'll be spending most of the ride either on a slow conveyor belt lift hill or on some sort of straight part of the track between two drops. You mostly just want to have interesting scenery around the ride and some kind of interaction with the rest of the park. So I think maps with terraforming like this are perfect for log flumes in combination with other rides as well. So for this whole area, I was trying to plan everything ahead of time and make sure that I had some opportunities to have the log flume interact with a roller coaster and with a pathwork, and have the pathwork interact with both of those as well, just kind of make everything very mixed. Which takes quite a bit of not per se planning, but it takes quite a bit of building stuff and then trying to visualize how it would look with everything in place, and then kind of using a trial and error method in that sense to figure out what you want the whole area to be shaped like. So I started off with the log flume because this is probably the most, not very flexible ride, because it involves a lot of straight pieces and you can't really put the drops in many places. And after this, I think the most important thing to add is the roller coaster, and for this I'm choosing to go with the regular steel coaster, but kind of make it a family coaster without inversions and mostly just large sweeping turns and some large hills. Very similar to Lisebergbanan in Liseberg in Sweden, which is a Schwarzkopf coaster and one of my favorite Schwarzkopf coasters. It's really not that intense, it's really not that exciting, But it really follows the terrain of the park, and it has a lot of interaction with different rides. And it's just such a cool, amazing, relaxing family coaster. Definitely one of my favorite family coasters out there. And probably the crowning masterpiece of Schwarzkopf. At least, supposedly, I've heard from some people that Lisebergbahnern is Anton Schwarzkopf's own favorite coaster that he's worked on. Although, I'm not entirely sure on that one. It also has a slightly different track than many of the other Schwarzkopf coasters. Where usually Schwarzkopf coasters have their spine just below the track ties. This one has the spine in the middle of the track ties. So it's kind of a really strange track type where you've got 3 tubes right next to each other. The ones on the outside being the rails and the one in the middle being the spine there just to make the whole track stronger. But yeah, it's a really cool coaster. I really love it. And honestly, one of the highlights at Liseberg, I think. But yeah, that was my inspiration. I am really trying to stretch out how much I'm talking about this coaster because I struggled quite a bit with the layout here, just because space is so limited and I really wanted 2 curves that go into 2 different directions, because that looks really nice. But it was really difficult to fit anything in and also get a decent speed going. So at this point, for instance, I've got these hills going over the middle of the track here, going over the Log Flume. But at that point, it was really just kind of creeping over these hills at a very slow speed. So I wasn't too happy with that. So eventually I ended up removing this idea as well, just making the lift hill a little bit taller. Really the thing that made all of this difficult is the Log Flume, which I have to get over somehow. While at the same time, I also want to make this coaster very terrain conforming. And I never want it to be, too up high from wherever the ground is at any point. I think, actually, if this were a scenario where you're not allowed to build above tree height, this coaster would make that... I think you'd be able to build this. So, yeah, I'm trying to follow the terrain as much as I can here. Eventually, I ended up with this layout, with the coaster just barely making it over the Log Flume and finally coming back to go into the middle of this area, which is all going to be paths and scenery, and kind of drop down below a bridge for pedestrians, which I think is really cool interactions with the path. That'll make the whole area look more interesting for people not on the coaster, but it should also make the coaster itself more interesting with a head chopper diving underneath the path. So yeah, that's always quite good. I did end up removing that helix there at the end, as you can see, just because I couldn't figure out a way to fit a path leading to the station there. The station is kind of in a completely different area, which, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure how I feel about that, but I also wanted to draw this lake into the rest of the park, so at least having the station here forces people to go down to this lake and see this other view, because I had to manually make this lake because it didn't come with the scenario and I thought it would look quite good. So I'm trying to make the most of it as well and actually use it to incorporate it into the scenery and into the general landscape of the park. So yeah, that is basically how this works. But there's not going to be anything else here because it's just really limited in terms of space. It's really just going to be the station of the coaster. But altogether, I think there's some decent interaction between the coaster and the Log Flume. And now that the 2 big rides are in place, now is when I actually figure out most of the rest of the path and scenery work, because you can just generally kind of fit that in between different areas. So yeah, I did consider, however, where I wanted to place buildings. So some of those areas that you can see left open between the paths will be buildings and flat rides and such. Now what I think is also quite interesting here is this area just above the curve of the Log Flume. I always wanted to have the Log Flume covered here and have it go into a little indoor area. The only problem is that the Log Flume is kind of sunken into the water here, which is quite cool. I really love that in Parkitect you're able to build Log Flumes into the ground and into the water. That's something that I wish we had in Roller Coaster Tycoon, because you can really just, I think you can get it up to a quarter below the height of the grid and it won't form a tunnel or anything, and it will really just make a trench of water inside the lake or inside the ground wherever you're building the Log Flume. So that's super cool, The only thing is that you're not able to build paths a half step above that because there's just barely not enough clearance. So I couldn't build the path above the curve of the Log Flume with actual path. So I took some roof pieces and raised them up a little bit to make the clearance right, and basically made a little seating area that people cannot actually go to because it's all just scenery. So yeah, it's just for show, but I thought it would look much better than having actual paths there and having to raise them even more, because then it would just sort of cut off this area from the rest of the paths in terms of aesthetics. So yeah, I'd rather have design over function in this case. That said, there should be plenty of seating areas on the actual paths as well, so it should be more or less fine. Now, something that I don't always do, but especially for this scenario I think would look quite good, is adding some scenery to some of these cliffs. So you always get these cliffs when you're chipping away at the terraforming and you leave some straight walls, and the game automatically gives it a kind of earthen texture. But for this scenario I thought that wouldn't really fit, so for some of the cliffs I've gone for a stucco wooden beam texture, and then for some of the other ones it's really just wooden walls, especially on the queue line there, which honestly I think looks a little bit better than just having the regular in-game cliff textures. It's a little bit more work, but I do like it, especially given the rustic kind of look of this scenario. And yeah, as for scenery, I'm trying to fit this in with the scenery that's already in the park, even if it's very basic. Again, this was one of the first scenarios that I made, and I have to say I also tried to keep the scenery that I added in the scenarios as minimalistic as possible, so that anybody could easily pick up the parks and try to continue in a similar style. So yeah, I wouldn't personally want to over-theme the scenarios, because you want to leave a lot of that up to the player. I think a scenario should really only give the player a basis to work with, or some inspiration to start off with. But really not more than that. So yeah, it's quite basic, but I'm keeping the generic theme here. And actually for my inspiration this time, I went back all the way to Catfish Cove, which is a custom scenery set that Shy Guy made for Rollercoaster Tycoon 3, which is based on an actual miniature theme park that he's made. And it's just a really simple set of walls and roofs, and they're all different shades of brown. It's really quite simple, but it very much fits the style of the scenario, I think. So that's what I'm mostly going for. It's a bit similar to Alpine, but there's a lot more wooden textures, less timber work, and just an overall, I guess, more of an American sort of style to it. Maybe Vermont or something like that. Not entirely sure, but given that Shy Guy is an American, even though the Catfish Cove was next to the Alpine area in his park, if I remember correctly, it definitely feels like it should be an American kind of style as opposed to European Alpine, which is quite different. And yeah, that's also the station building. Very much follows the same. It really kind of looks like a building that was made with the Catfish Cove set in Rollercoaster Tycoon 3. I don't know how much is available on the internet about this, but if you go ahead and compare it, the brown colors really fit the roof and the wall textures that the Catfish Cove set had. But yeah, I'm keeping everything quite minimal except for very small details like the timber work on some of the gables there. And just that overall shape for a station I really like. It's just a kind of, I don't know, it's just a sort of design that works every single time, to have one main stretch of building in the same direction as the coaster track, where you put the queue and the exit path underneath that, and then somewhere around the front of the station you just put an extra element that, you know, points toward the entrance of the station. And it's just really well balanced. I like that whole way of making stations. I think after a while, the further I get into these scenarios, you could probably notice that my stations all start looking very similar. But I mean, in real life, stations also very typically do this. Have just one gabled roof in the same direction as the coaster track is going, and then some kind of element to mark where the front is, where the entrance of the station is, where you want to get in. So yeah, I think it works well. and it's always a very simple way to build a decent station without having to experiment too much or go out of your comfort zone. And moving on from here, I'm building a drop tower here, which I think is something that I just put there because it's the smallest flat ride and it fits just about anywhere you want it to fit. And really no other reason, it's just the best thing to fit in here. We don't have a lot of flat rides in this scenario actually, so that's something that I might research. But before I do that, I need to research the stalls, because we only start out with a vending machine for food and drinks, and that's not gonna do. So that's actually kind of a challenge about this scenario. You really need to research right from the get-go and make sure you get some stalls, because otherwise you could get in trouble for that later on. I'm not sure to what extent guests can satisfy themselves with a vending machine, but I mean, it only sells soda or pop, or whatever you want to say, and chips or crisps or whatever you want to say there. But you know, that's not a very healthy, balanced diet, so that's something I should get into as well. You might have noticed also that I've had my game on pause the whole time, and that's partly because you start off with so much money in this scenario that I could, you know, just let it be paused and still keep building until I run out of money. But also, I'm trying to go for those optional challenges again. I'm not sure how well it's gonna work, but I think it'll be nice to try it at least. So yeah, I might keep the game paused more often, but I do have to say, I prefer playing with the game unpaused. Just seeing the park run and seeing guests react to what you're building in real time, it's just so much more satisfying than building everything in one go while the game is paused and then resuming it at some point to try and get those challenge goals. Not to mention that, you know, you really don't need to get the challenge goals per se. So yeah, I don't know if I'm gonna keep doing this, but for this scenario it works out because you have a lot of money at the start, and I figured might as well try. Now at this point I did open up the park, so I think it's time to let it run for a while and see how the park is doing and if we can actually run a profit on this. Yeah, so basically I have loads of money. I'm almost reaching that $2,000 a month goal. I actually had it for 1 month, although we might have to hold it for a few months. I don't think it should be too difficult to get there. And also my experiences rating is almost 75%, and as you can see I'm also getting close to the 400 guests that we need to get into the park. So yeah, altogether, it doesn't seem like a very difficult scenario so far, but it's been a lot of fun trying to fit all of this scenery into this very difficult to work with terrain. There's not a lot of flat space to work with, so you really kind of have to be creative there. My next plans are actually to build a Ferris wheel over here covering this path. I think that should be interesting and a good way to actually get a good view from the Ferris wheel, and also a flat ride over here. And if I really need to, I could build an inverted coaster, because I accidentally got that out of research because I forgot to switch the research to shops on time, so they ended up researching a coaster anyway, but that could be useful. The inverted coaster is always a lot of fun to build and very good to draw in guests and earn extra cash as well. But yeah, aside from that, I think we're doing quite fine. I just got a burger stall, so at last people can actually eat something slightly healthier than chips, but yeah, it's still not the best thing, so whatever, it's theme park food. When do theme parks actually have good food? So yeah, altogether, park is doing quite well. I think it could actually, yeah, we should do a quick POV of this coaster. It doesn't have super good stats, but you know, it's just a family coaster, so considering what it is, I think it works quite well. Okay, maybe I should add a second or two to the block break timing there. But yeah, it's just doing some curves around this area. Nothing too special. I do want to put some more trees in here as well. That's one of the things that I still wanted to do as well. Along with, of course, the station, which I haven't done for this coaster either. But yeah, it's really coming together, I think. And the way that everything interacts with the park is definitely the strongest point about this park. And yeah, it's also quite a short layout, because at this point it's already over. But it does end on a high note, I think, with that final drop actually being the largest drop in the ride. And I think it also reaches the maximum speed in this part. But yeah, that's it. I'm gonna keep on building and try to get to those objectives as soon as possible. Not because I want to try and rush every scenario, but now that I can and I have the opportunity to meet the challenge goals, I definitely want to go for it. So I want to start off by building the station for the coaster and basically get that out of the way. And also in the meantime, I'm gonna let the game play, not like I'm doing right now, but in a little bit I'll unpause the game and try to let people keep going to the park and see how close to the goals I can actually get. Because I did just check, and it turns out that this is one of the scenarios where you have to hold the goals for 2 months in order to actually finish the scenario, which is actually kind of helpful in my case, because I'm trying to avoid accidentally reaching all of the objectives while I'm in the middle of the time lapse and I don't even realize that I just finished the map, which is kind of anticlimactic. But with cases like this, it gives you a very neat progress bar to let you know just how far into the scenario you are and whether you're reaching the objective. So yeah, that's pretty cool. Also, what's interesting about this building, I think, is these walls, which are kind of an object that I don't use too many times for wooden buildings. But the thing about this wall is, with all of the vertical kind of textures on it, the thing is, I'm still not sure whether it's supposed to be a steel wall or a wooden one, or what kind of material it is. But in a sense, this is something that I really like about Parkitect. The way that a lot of the textures are really minimalistic and context dependent allow you to basically use them in any kind of context that you want and to substitute for any kind of material that you want. So in this case, very similar to the rest of the park, I would imagine this to be yellow painted planks for the walls, but these things usually kind of work as some sort of grey metal wall. So it really just depends on the kind of color that you give them and what the overall scenery and theme of the surrounding area is, what kind of texture, what kind of feeling the walls will have. So just something about Parkitect that allows you to basically use any pieces, any material or anything ever, because everything is so minimalistic in design, and I quite like that. But yeah, that's basically the station. Very simple building, very similar also to the station of the Log Flume. Although it is definitely a bit different. It has some of those more gentle roofs as well, and just an overall slightly different shape. But I think the composition of it is pretty similar. Now at this point, I was actually kind of having trouble. I really underestimated the scenario at this point because I didn't have too much stuff. And I was just getting vandalism and litter all over the park, and that dramatically decreased my park rating, and then people left the park and I wasn't making enough profit anymore, and things just kind of turned into a big avalanche of trouble from there. But eventually I fixed all of those issues and things started going well again. But yeah, really always try to pay attention to vandalism and things like that in your park, because I tend to forget about the actual management when I'm building stuff. And yeah, you can really fail a scenario due to just a few months of not managing the park well enough. So that's something that almost happened here, but aside from that, now that I've turned the situation around, I'm actually reaching the goals really quickly, so I'm not going to have that much time anymore to work on stuff in this scenario. So for one, I plopped down a staff building on next to the pond here, which is partly scenery. I think it looks quite nice to have it there. But you also just need one of these in each of your parks, and usually the scenarios don't come with them, so that's something to keep in mind. And also a Ferris wheel here over the paths, as I wanted to do, just because I think that gives you the best view of the park. Both of the side with Bumblebee, the flying coaster, as well as the area which I've just built in this episode. And it just gives me another excuse to build some more scenery around it as well. So yeah, that's that weird passage through the hills with a Ferris wheel on top of it, which is a bit unusual, but I kind of like it. And aside from that, I'm just adding some foliage everywhere because I added some pretty detailed foliage with a lot of ground shrubbery around the areas that I newly built. So I wanted to also put some of that foliage in the older areas of the park that I didn't build, but that the scenario already came with. And my final ride of this park is going to be a spiral slide. And yeah, that is basically it. 3 flat rides, a log flume, and a coaster. And aside from that, it's really just all down to management. But that's all it took for me to finish the scenario. So yeah, really not too difficult. I do have to say, and you might have noticed this also on some of my time lapses, I got a lot of really bad weather, and I don't know whether I just got unlucky with this or whether it's actually a parameter that is supposed to make this scenario more difficult, but it's definitely something that can rain on your parade if you're trying to hold the goals for 2 months, because as soon as it rains, people are not going to ride the coasters, and you might not be able to get $2,000 in total revenue for 2 months in a row. But thankfully, it stayed sunny this whole time, the last few months. So I was able to reach these objectives, and as you can see, we're almost there. So let's take a look at the park and see how it's doing. So I think I totally jinxed it by talking about the rain, because now it started raining. But to be honest, it's not really an issue, because at this point it's way too late anyway. I'm gonna reach these objectives and it should be fine. So yeah, the park is doing quite well. People are still riding the Log Flume just because they are stuck in the queue and now they're gonna have to ride it anyway. And the same goes for the coaster. So sometimes having these slightly longer queues can definitely be handy to try and cover the rainy periods as well. But yeah, we're getting there, and there's really not too much else to show off in the park anymore either. We've got the slide here, and yeah, that's basically it. And the Ferris wheel here, so there's a bit of detailing and scenery around that as well. But aside from that, I really didn't build too much in this park. As I said, 5 rides and a bunch of scenery. I did spend quite a bit of time trying to make all of the rides interact as much as possible with each other, so for me personally it did feel like more labor than the usual just plopping down rides or making quick coaster layouts, but that's also really fun as well. Like, I really like trying to make rides interact with each other and working with difficult terrain. So as far as I know, some of the later scenarios are definitely going to be more fun in that regard as well. But yeah, altogether, I have to say, this was quite an easy scenario, to be very honest. Despite the fact that you have a lot of objectives, none of them are particularly hard. And I also have to say, I made the map quite a bit easier by giving you Bumblebee right from the start, because this thing is pretty profitable and efficient. So yeah, that's definitely quite a helping hand there. But that said, the terrain of the map did turn out to be quite interesting to work with. I have to admit, this is a scenario that I played through earlier when I was making the scenario. I officially didn't do any beta testing. I wasn't supposed to do any testing, but for some of the scenarios I just played through them entirely for fun, basically, but also to kind of test how things were going and what would be a good scenario or not. And this is one of them, so this is actually one of the scenarios that I know best and where I'm kind of familiar with the terrain, even more so than just any other scenario that I've worked on. So there's that. But to be fair, I did change quite a few things about the terrain in this playthrough as well. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with it, despite the fact that it's quite minimalistic and simple, and there's not too much that I added to the park. So yeah, on that note, I'd like to check out what the next map is going to be, because I honestly have no idea. I totally didn't save there, but I know for sure that I saved just before reaching the objective, so that's fine. And yeah, we got that little observation hut, which would be used for any park rangers or whatever. Really, the idea of this park was to be somewhere in a national park kind of setting. So yeah, we got that plopped down as our trophy here, and I think the next one is going to be Coaster Canyon. Yeah, that looks like it's going to be Coaster Canyon. Yep, that's it. Alright, so I never actually knew that this was here on the map, but this is also one of the scenarios that I've worked on. And the terrain on the map really looks just like the one in the actual scenario. So this one is going to be very interesting. I've actually heard quite a few stories about this one. I usually like to check the subreddits and other places to see how people are doing in the scenarios and what some of their favorite scenarios are, what they dislike and like about it. So honestly, you can leave all of your constructive criticism in the comment section as well, especially if you have negative criticism, because that's an important lesson and maybe something that could be changed about the scenarios. But yeah, this is one that I've read a lot about, because it seems like people like the fact that you have to build a certain amount of coasters in the park with a certain kind of excitement rating, in addition to getting a certain amount of guests as well. And then the optional goal on this one is actually much more optional than all the goals so far, because the optional goal is to have 700 guests. So if you somehow get 700 guests with only 5 coasters, I suspect you get some kind of bonus from that, but I don't remember exactly how all of that went. Either way, for next episode I'm gonna have to decide between Orchard Acres and Coaster Canyon, and I'm really not sure which one of these two I would choose, but that's something for another day. For now, I'd like to thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you guys in the next episode.